And today's speaker, Ellen Shrecker, holds both an MA and a PhD from Harvard, and she's taught at Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, New York University, the New School for Social Research, and most recently, Yeshiva University, which she left last spring to embark on what she calls a lifelong sabbatical, to write another book and to pursue other research interests. From 1998 to 2002, Professor Shrecker was editor of Academe, the Journal of the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP. Although her best-known book is Many Are the Crimes, McCarthyism in America, she has written on related topics such as political repression, academic freedom, Soviet espionage during the Cold War, as well as on the Franco-American relations in the 1920s. And she has also authored a Chinese cookbook. Please join me in welcoming Ellen Shrecker.
Okay, let me begin. I think actually this is probably symbolic of what I'll be talking about. I'm retiring at just the right time, I guess. You know, anybody over the age of 50 really can't deal with this stuff. But anyhow, I want to begin with a few stories that I think are going to illustrate some of the themes that I'm going to be discussing this afternoon with regard to the relationship between contemporary capitalism and higher education. So the summer before last, the University of Virginia Board of Trustees fired the school's president, Teresa Sullivan, because she just wasn't evincing enough enthusiasm for online education. The head of the board had read a puff piece about it in the Wall Street Journal and decided that Virginia was lagging in this crucial component of 21st century higher education, so Sullivan had to go. The faculty was outraged, and actually with the help of the allies on the student body and the administration and even some trustees, it was able to reverse Sullivan's dismissal. Last month, the graduate school faculty at Rutgers passed a resolution against the implementation of the university's contract with an educational company called Pearson E-College to offer graduate courses online. The faculty was objecting to the increasing corporate presence on campus, as well as to the possibility that the Pearson contract might infringe upon their academic freedom and intellectual property rights. And just last week, the president of the University of Wyoming was forced to resign after a few months in office because he had fired or forced out many of the school's top administrators. They were, the now former president, Robert J. Sternberg, explained, unsympathetic to his role as a, and I'm quoting him, disruptive innovator. These are only a few of the dozens of such episodes that reveal the ways in which the growing integration of higher education into the global capitalist system is reconfiguring that system of education. And in my talk this afternoon, I hope to put these events into that broader context. I want to show specifically how capitalist pressures are transforming American higher education, most of the time in ways that conflict with its traditional mission of seeking truth, transmitting knowledge, and serving society. Now, I'm oversimplifying here. For the glory, or at least the former glory, of American higher education is that because it comprises so many different kinds of institutions, it can support not one, but many missions. Missions that range from one of my colleagues' current research into the burial practices of 18th century Germans to my stepdaughter's training as an MRI technician. Significantly, American campuses also shelter free expression and provide a haven for unorthodox and even innovative ideas. They seek to open their students' minds by offering intellectual experiences that expose them to new ideas and unfamiliar cultures, and thus enable them to become, one hopes, thoughtful citizens of a rapidly changing world. But I'm a historian, and we pride ourselves on nuance and on making complex stories even more complicated. So, before I look at what's happening today, I want to offer a bit of background that will help us understand the current state of American higher education. Let's begin by looking at where we came from. The so-called golden age of American higher education, and I'm sure those of you with the same color hair I have will recall that decade and a half from the mid-1950s to the early 1970s. It was a moment when the American economy was booming, the middle class was growing, and the United States dominated world markets and faced little foreign competition. It was just at that moment, in 1957, that the Soviet Union launched its Sputnik space satellite, and the nation's leaders became concerned. They panicked, actually, and they became concerned about our supposedly inadequate system of higher education. It was also the moment when American colleges and universities were expanding as they anticipated a whole deluge of baby boomers. And finally, it was also the moment when, propelled in large part by the civil rights movement, the nation's ruling elites sought to increase economic and social mobility by expanding access to higher education. At that time, it actually seemed possible that the United States would develop a truly democratic system of high-quality mass higher education that would enable any qualified individual to go to college. To meet all these new demands, most states built new colleges and universities. They upgraded teachers' colleges to liberal arts schools, and they turned regional four-year colleges into full-fledged universities. Since 1945, the actual numbers of institutions have more than tripled. Student bodies grew as well. They expanded 31% in the 1950s, 120% in the 60s, 45% in the 1970s, and it's a process that's still going on. From just under 6 million students in 1965, there are now about 18 million. And in addition, during the boom years of the 1950s and 60s, there was little financial pressure on these students, many of whom were attending institutions like the municipal colleges of New York City, where the tuition was free, or the University of California system, where it was nearly so. Foundations, states, and the federal government literally threw money at higher education. I didn't even apply to graduate school, and I got money for it. Worried about not having enough professors for the baby boomers who were coming in, they encouraged people to go to graduate school. Fellowships and grants were easy to get. Living expenses were low. In housing, if you didn't mind living in a sort of somewhat bohemian manner, was equally cheap. As a result, graduate schools expanded even more massively than undergraduate ones, and they had no trouble placing their students in full-time tenure-track jobs, at least the men. Often these guys hadn't even finished their dissertations. And then, all of a sudden, sometime in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the golden age came to an end. The economic boom petered out as the United States balance of trade turned sour. The Vietnam War brought on inflation and a fiscal crisis, And the Arab oil embargo of 1973 intensified that inflation and made it clear that economic expansion could no longer be taken for granted. As the economy tanked, America's political culture shifted to the right. It embraced a neoliberal ideology that downgraded the public sphere just as it glorified the private one. Businessmen who during the expansionist 50s and 60s were willing to share the growing pie with their workers now pulled back and began to fight unions. They also turned against the state, demanding lower taxes and less government regulation. And they became more politically active. They organized new pressure groups and revitalized old ones while funding conservative think tanks and intellectuals to bring their neoliberal agenda into the mainstream. They mounted a surprisingly self-conscious campaign to wrest control of the nation's public discourse from the 1960s radicals, who they believed had hijacked American political culture and turned it against the corporate sector. And in fact, there is a document that spells all of this out that was written in the early 70s by the future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell that actually talks about the need to pour money into a kind of public relations campaign against the quote-unquote radical left. Much of that right-wing campaign focused on the academy. It sought to delegitimize mainstream scholarship by subsidizing writers like Dinesh D'Souza or Alan Bloom to portray universities as hotbeds of political correctness that were teeming with tenured radicals, cross-dressers, or worse, who hated white men, wrote incomprehensible prose, and only worked 12 hours a week. This conservative campaign also established alternative sources of expertise, like the right-wing Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, that fed neoliberal advice and analysis to journalists and policymakers. By the 1980s, these efforts came to fruition. With the help of the Reagan administration, such corporate values as individualism, competition, and a short-term mindset came to dominate our political discourse. With regard to higher education, the single most deleterious effect of that neoliberal triumph was the growing reluctance of American politicians to fund the public sector. Unwilling, or in some cases unable to raise taxes, whipsawed by ballooning costs of prisons and health care, and required by law to balance their budgets, state legislators who had once just poured money proudly into their public colleges and universities began to cut back. Of course, it didn't help that the political unrest on the nation's campuses alienated many of these politicians. Ronald Reagan was typical here. One of his first acts after becoming governor of California was to cut Berkeley's annual appropriations. Other states followed suit. As a result, even if the dollar amount of state aid did not decline, as actually most of the time it didn't, student populations continued to grow, and the percentage of an institution's budget funded by the state began to decline. So that even before the recent financial meltdown, the reductions in state support for public higher education were quite stunning. Schools that had once had 35 to 60% of their operating expenses covered by their legislatures are in some cases receiving less than 10%. The University of Virginia, just to take one of the most glaring examples, gets all of 7% of its funding from the Commonwealth and has privatized several of its professional schools. Its leaders are now actually thinking of severing the school entirely from the state system, as several Oregon universities have already done. A former president of the University of Michigan, where state financing has dropped from 70% in 1960 to 17% today, put the situation this way. We used to be state-supported, then state-assisted, and now we are state-located. It is important to realize that the inflation and financial crunch of the late 60s hit private schools as well. A few actually dipped into their endowments to cover basic operating expenses, and many, as we shall see, began to raise their tuitions. At the same time, and we're talking about the early 70s here, the Nixon administration also cut back, or rather not so much cut back as redirected the money it was allocating to higher education. It didn't reduce its support for scientific research, though it did not increase it as much as it previously had. And as a result, since more and more scientists are competing for the same amount of funding, grants have become much harder to get. The main change, however, was that Washington stopped giving money directly to individual colleges and universities. Instead, under the growing influence of neoliberalism, it provided grants and loans to individual students that they could then take into the academic marketplace. Caught in this financial crunch, college and university administrators, who only a few years before had actually been spending money as if there was no tomorrow, understandably became obsessed with their bottom lines. They coped, of course, and as I hope to show in the rest of my talk this afternoon, the measures that they took were to transform the academy in ways that not only eroded the promise of mass higher education, but also seriously compromised the quality of that education. Most institutions adopted three strategies. One, they raised their tuitions and sought new sources of income. Two, they cut costs. And three, they embraced a more corporate mode of operations. So, let's begin by looking at the ways that universities tried to raise money. First, they sought to capitalize on the research of their faculty members, and I'm sure people here know that all too well. In this, they were helped by a 1960 law that allowed academic institutions to commercialize the federally funded work that had been done on their campuses. A few top-tier institutions, Stanford and Wisconsin come to mind, for example, made hundreds of millions of dollars from their scientists' findings and the startup companies that they founded. But most schools never hit that jackpot. Often what came to be called the technology transfer offices that they set up to license their faculty's research cost more to run than they ever brought in. Even so, that kind of business boomed. In 1979, the academic community received 264 patents. In 2001, it got 3,200. Though the federal government still financed most research on campus, universities began to put pressure on their scientists to seek outside corporate funding as well. That kind of funding became especially important in fields like computers, agriculture, and biotechnology. But it came with strings attached. After all, these companies were in business to make a profit, not to further knowledge. Thus, for example, they sometimes required the scientists they were funding to hold back from publishing their results until they could be marketed. And they sometimes were known to pull the plug and drop a project in the middle if the results were not going to be remunerative enough. In addition, The pressure for corporate funding exacerbated what had been a long-standing problem of skewing research towards projects that could attract financial support, even if they might not be the most intellectually important. And at some schools, administrators and tenure committees began to assess faculty members on the commercial as well as the scientific value of their work. Finally, these corporate ties can create conflicts of interest that compromise the integrity of someone's work, or as a piece in this past Sunday's New York Times revealed about an engineering professor cum entrepreneur at Georgia Tech, some faculty members' business interests can divert them from their academic responsibilities. Now, these scientific partnerships were far from higher education's only ventures into the corporate world. Academic institutions built office parks on university land, and if they had winning athletic teams, they licensed their logos to sportswear manufacturers. And as Rutgers tried to do, they're joining technology companies to market courses over the internet. But above all, their main source of new income was their students' tuition, which, as the states continued to cut back in their support of higher education, inexorably rose as a percentage of those institutions' budgets. By 2011, the University of California was receiving more money from its students than from the state, and this was happening almost everywhere. I'm going to bore you, I think, with a few figures, but they do show something about the extent to which tuitions are, and in other words, students' loans, are supporting higher education. If we look just at public four-year colleges, the change between 2000 and 2010 has been stunning. Though federal aid remains stable at about 15%, where these schools once got 56% of their budgets from the states and only 32% from tuition. Now they only get 38% from the state and 48% from tuition. And of course, those tuitions are soaring. That at the University of California, for example, rose 2,000% from the 1970s to the present. And the formerly free four-year colleges of the City University of New York now charge nearly $7,000 a year. And that's just for in-state tuitions, which at most, the average at four-year public institutions has tripled in the 30 years between 1980 and 2010, from $2,500 to $16,000. And of course, all public schools, if they can, charge more to out-of-state residents, sometimes, as at the University of Michigan, 3 times as much. Meanwhile, private schools, which had always relied on their students' tuitions, raised them as well, nearly 6 times between 1980 and 2010. So just to take an example that's somewhat close to home, the sticker price at Case Western Reserve is now $58,248. which makes it a contender with the nation's most expensive school, Sarah Lawrence, which charges something over $60,000, and puts it in the same league as the University of Chicago, Columbia, and Washington University in St. Louis, all of which cost about $59,000. Now, it's true that many of these schools, both public and private, do offer financial aid. But even so, many students are relying on loans to get through college, especially if they attend less affluent colleges and universities. At the moment, the average amount of college debt that current graduates have accumulated is $27,000. I'm going to return to the implications of the high cost of attending college, but I first want to look at how the increasing reliance on tuition payments has transformed higher education. To begin with, as American colleges and universities became ever more dependent on their students' tuitions, they entered an increasingly heated competition for all those warm tuition-bearing bodies. They began to, as a result, administrators came to view students as customers, to be courted and to be catered to. They began to market their schools. Many, for example, hired outside consultants to advise them about increasing their so-called brand recognition. They also sought to attract students by indulging in what Andrew Hacker and Claudia Dreyfus have recently called an amenities arms race. Resources went into elaborate fitness centers, state-of-the-art computer facilities, and gourmet dining halls. Schools spent millions of dollars on new stadiums and extravagantly paid football coaches in the hope the championship teams would pull in more students, as well as TV royalties and alumni gifts. And this, despite the, I think, well-known fact that all but a few athletic programs ever made money. Institutions also offered expensive perks, high salaries, and merit scholarships to the star professors and undergraduates with high test scores, who, it was believed, would raise the school's ranking in the all-important U.S. News and World Report survey. Vanderbilt, and I love this one, Vanderbilt University actually asked Hillel to establish a center on campus so that it could woo Jewish students who supposedly higher SAT scores would make the institution more competitive. In addition, those public institutions that could abandoned their local and regional focus and recruited higher-paying students from other states and foreign countries. I think Michigan now has about 35% of its student body coming from outside the state. At the same time, in response to the demands of financially pressed students and their parents, colleges and universities offer ever more vocationally oriented programs in fields that those families hoped would provide immediate employment after graduation. But even as academic administrators scrambled to raise their enrollments, they also cut costs. This is their second strategy. And like their corporate peers, they outsource whatever they can. On many campuses, bookstores, food services, and security operations are no longer being provided by university employees. You would think that instruction, at least, would remain in the institution's hands. But even here, there are reports of colleges and universities turning over introductory languages and other courses to commercial vendors. Meanwhile, institutions are cutting down academic presses, paring library budgets, and delaying routine maintenance on older buildings. They're also saving money in less obvious ways. NYU, for example, is concerned about the high cost of New York City real estate. And so one of the reasons why it's been so busy establishing overseas campuses, that it encourages its undergraduates to attend, is that it will save money. Although these overseas experiences are touted as preparing its students for the globalized future, in fact, this move will free up about a quarter of NYU's dormitory space. And that will allow the school to increase its enrollment without having to expand its physical plant. Brilliant. The most important cost cutting, however, affects the teaching staff. Institutions are now replacing tenured and tenure-track faculty members with part-time and temporary instructors. At the moment, about 75% of the nation's college and university teachers have these contingent appointments, most of which not only pay badly, but rarely offer job security or benefits. That's right. 3/4 of all teaching is done by part-timers and non-tenure track instructors. This casualization of the faculty constitutes by far, and I can't emphasize this enough, the most serious challenge to the quality of American higher education. Now, the academic community is not unique here. Throughout the US economy, employers are reducing wages and relying on part-time or temporary workers. And one of the main sort of advocates for adjunct professors has noted that the only other profession that, or the only other occupation that has transformed itself so thoroughly from full-time work to part-time work is taxi driving. But because colleges and universities still give lip service to their educational missions, administrators have to deny that they're using contingent labor to save money. So instead they insist part-time and short-term teachers give them the quote-unquote flexibility they need to meet the fast-changing demands of the academic marketplace. But since most schools hire the same adjuncts and temporary instructors to teach the same courses year after year, that rationalization sounds a little bit thin. Actually, it doesn't matter whether this transformation was a conscious move on the part of academic administrators or whether it happened inadvertently as cost-conscious bureaucrats simply raised enrollments without increasing the size of the regular tenure-track faculty or replacing retired professors. What matters is that the casualization of the faculty is destroying the quality of academic jobs and thus making it hard to maintain the quality of American higher education. It's also threatening the future viability of the academic profession. For the academy is eating its seed corn. The paucity of decent jobs is discouraging talented men and women from becoming professors. If nothing else, it's going to militate against diversifying the nation's faculty, since only those folks who have well-paid partners or private incomes are able to teach college. Though most adjuncts and temporary instructors are just as qualified as their tenured and tenure-track colleagues, and we have to recognize this, they are just victims of the marketplace. Their terrible working conditions and inadequate remuneration make it hard for them to provide the kind of education that their students really deserve. To begin with, part-time faculty members can rarely earn a living wage. Adjuncts average about $3,000 to $4,000 a course, though some make as little as $1,500. As a result, if they can get the work, they teach 4, 5, or 6 classes a semester, sometimes at several different schools. Actually, if we take into account the long hours they put in, they're not even earning the minimum wage. Many, for example, rely on food stamps. And I was just at a conference sponsored by a union that's trying to organize adjuncts in the Boston area, and heard all kinds of stories of what kinds of work they had to do to supplement their income. do not have benefits or a retirement unless, and this is important, unless they have a good union contract. And many adjuncts are beginning to organize now. Obamacare actually may be no solution for them because many schools are reducing these teachers' course loads specifically in order to make sure that they don't have to pay for them under that new program. And to make matters worse, even if their commuting schedules allow these freeway flyers, or what else are they called, road scholars, to hold office hours for which they are rarely paid. They do not always have offices. And at this adjuncts meeting, somebody showed me a slide of a office of how a adjunct had organized his office in the trunk of his car with the different readings, so he wouldn't have to lug them around with him by hand. They were all very nicely organized there in the trunk. Some of these people meet their students in campus cafeterias, and others actually do use their cars in the school's parking lots. In addition, many are hired at the very last minute, selected more for their availability than for their expertise in the subject matter they teach. As for scholarship, forget it. They have neither the time nor the professional resources, and at some institutions, they don't even have access to computers or libraries. Nor do they get any respect. Their students, who unfortunately are unaware of the workings of the institutions they attend, are still deferential. But their tenured and tenure-track colleagues rarely treat them as fellow scholars. That is, if they ever even meet them. Contingent faculty members also lack academic freedom, since they can be fired at any time, for any reason, or actually for no reason at all. They are also under pressure to inflate their grades. Not only does their continued employment depend on student evaluations, but their superiors are under pressure to maintain enrollments, which means, of course, that they have to make sure that not too many students flunk out. All of this militates against the ability of all but the most superhuman adjuncts to devote enough time and energy to their students, who, it turns out, are the ones who most need that time and energy. For most of the courses that contingent faculty members teach are the introductory courses that all students must take at the beginning of their college careers. These are courses like freshman composition or remedial math that simply cry out for individualized attention. But such attention may become a relic of the past if it isn't already. Many universities are now exploring ways to provide courses without the instructional costs associated with even such cheap labor as adjuncts. In particular, of course, they are looking for that technological quick fix. The current craze is the MOOC. How many of you have heard of the MOOC? Okay, I don't have to explain it too much then. It's that synonym for massive open online courses that seems to be extremely attractive to venture capitalists. In their present configuration, MOOCs use videotaped lectures by hotshot professors, online discussions, and peer-graded exercises to reach hundreds of thousands of students all over the world. Now, at the moment, MOOCs are free, but their proponents are talking about developing methods of credentialing that would let providers start to make money from them. Besides the fact that over 90% of the students enrolled in a MOOC drop out, and I'm one of those dropouts. I left even before the course started because the preliminary classroom lecture and discussion was so boring. It's by no means clear that any of these high-tech developments save money. Rarely, if ever, however, does the propaganda about their promise mention how much they cost. And if what happened at my own former institution is typical, administrators love to throw money into technology about which they know little. And they often purchase systems that don't work very well and are very soon obsolete. Nonetheless, this stuff has been touted by pundits, foundations, corporations, and politicians as the panacea for higher education. Now, it's possible that someday these innovations will pan out, but it is also possible that their troubles occur because the faculty members who must implement them rarely have a say in their selection. And the corporations that build them may have more influence with the administration, all of which, of course, brings us to the third strategy that institutions have embraced in order to solve their financial problems. And that is the adoption of a business-like style of management. Once money, rather than education, became the main concern of academic administrators, they turned to the corporate sector. In the process, they imbibed the competitive, individualistic, and short-term mindset that capitalism fosters. It was a mindset that not coincidentally aligned them with their donors and trustees. After all, as we well know, the main job of a university president is to raise money. And that means that he or she must hobnob with the 1%. It should therefore come as no surprise that the presidents who traveled in these rarefied circles came to adopt many of the values and practices of the business leaders they spent so much time courting. These presidents still spoke the traditional language of teaching, research, and service, but their real goal was to grow their institutions. As in the corporate world, stasis was failure. With such a mindset, we can easily see how someone like the University of Wyoming's now former president can conceive of his academic mission as quote-unquote disruption. Change, in and of itself, was the order of the day. His goal, he explained, was to make Wyoming, and I quote, the #1 land-grant institution in the country. In other words, it was not just to attract students that academic administrators hired Nobel Prize-winning economists or created fancy new nanotechnology centers or built $100 million football stadiums. It was also a matter of becoming #1 and making it into the big time. And at every level of the academy, that struggle for status continues. Second and third tier institutions upgraded their campuses with trophy architecture. They also raised their academic standards and demanded that their previously teaching-oriented faculties produce the same kind of research and publication as professors at Harvard and Berkeley. Once that level of competition became the order of the day, the academic community differed little in many respects from the corporate sector. Of course, given the dominance of neoliberalism, such a transformation may have seemed natural. After all, most other American institutions have also succumbed to the market. Think about healthcare. Significantly, however, even though higher education is, at least for the moment, a largely nonprofit undertaking, academic administrators did not try to protect their schools from the incursions of contemporary capitalism, nor, perhaps, did they want to. After all, the more hierarchical practices of American business granted full-time managers much more power and freedom to act than the traditional consensus building and time-consuming operations of shared academic governance. Decisions are now made for financial rather than educational reasons, often without consulting or even informing the faculty, as was the case at Rutgers. Could this transformation have been prevented? I'm not so sure. Tenured professors, perhaps the one group that might have protected the academy from the encroachments of the market ceded the field. Many traditional faculty leaders had been burned by the campus unrest of the 60s. Others had never been interested in faculty governance, and still others, as they witnessed the near overnight contraction of the job market, pulled back from anything that might threaten their careers. By the time they came to realize how completely corporatization had transformed their campuses, it may have been too late. Administrators of various kinds now outnumber faculty members within American higher education. That's right, more administrators than teachers. And they're making crucial educational decisions in such traditional areas of faculty concern as curriculum and instructional personnel. And of course, they're justifying their decisions in terms of institutional survival in a competitive neoliberal world. So, what are we to make of this educational landscape? At the moment, there is a national consensus that something is seriously wrong, even if there is no consensus about the nature of that problem, let alone how to fix it. Much of the mainstream discourse about higher education revolves around two issues: access and accountability. After all, it's obvious that the mid-20th century promise of social mobility through mass higher education has become a mirage. Just as the frontier supposedly provided a social safety net for 19th century Americans, so in today's post-industrial society, some kind of post-secondary education has become essential for attaining and maintaining a middle-class style of life. But its rising cost has put that education increasingly out of reach for many of the 99%. Moreover, the heavy debts that hang over others constrict their postgraduate options and skew their educations toward a vocational major. And as I've tried to show you this afternoon, it's clear that the main problem with higher education is political. It's the inadequate funding caused by the neoliberal attack on the public sector. But unless and until the nation's political leaders and private citizens decide to support higher education at a decent level, they will avoid dealing with the difficult political issues, and instead, they're going to continue to tout these trendy remedies that undermine the quality of that education without increasing its availability. Perhaps because they align with the contemporary worship of the market, these remedies do not confront the austerity that is destroying higher education. Instead, what they're doing is talking about accountability. If only we can get the right metrics for assessing the nation's institution of higher learning, we can fix all their problems. Or at least the educational entrepreneurs in the private sector can fix them. Politicians and so-called reformers of the Bill Gates variety, therefore, focus on things that can be measured. The main metrics here is probably graduation rates. However, few of these critics realize how much the personal stresses and inadequate resources contribute to making it so hard for many students to stay in school. Instead, they blame, these inefficient institutions and their stick-in-the-mud faculties. Another tool that these reformers push is something called outcomes assessment. I don't know if you use it here, but it's a pretty vague measurement that, as far as I can see, has already produced quite a flood of paperwork, considerable jargon, and very fat fees for outside consultants. And if nothing else, many of these supposed solutions really remind one of the strategies that have been doing such a terrific job on K-12 education with the No Child Left Behind law. And I guess you are hearing my irony. But much of what makes higher education so valuable cannot be quantified, nor can it be measured in dollars and cents. Unfortunately, however, contemporary capitalism has transformed American higher education from a public good into an individual benefit, and an increasingly narrow one to boot. For higher education is not just about preparation for making a living, although that's important. It's also about making a life worth living. But some things, and education is surely one of them, do not function well in a market. As our colleges and universities become increasingly commodified, they're contributing to, rather than reducing, the growing inequality of American society. Worse yet, I think they're surrendering their traditional function of challenging their students to become the well-informed and thoughtful citizens that an increasingly complicated society requires. Whether we can reverse this trend remains an open question. It's going to require a huge collective, and let me stress the word collective, effort. But we have no alternative. Thank you.
Open it up to Q&A, and if you have a question, be sure you have the microphone so that we can hear. Thank you.
Oh, no, not can't. Thanks very much for this talk. And I'm taken particularly by your last call. My name's Ken Ledford. I'm in the history department here. By your call for collective action, which I think is exactly on the point. As somebody who was a student during that transition you described, and in fact whose graduate career was delayed because of the effects of the market that you described, I wasn't in the academy as a faculty member as the transition was going on to see whether I could recognize it and resist it as it was happening. But I've been active in faculty governance now, and all of the debates you name are debates that are going on this campus. One of the difficulties for resisting neoliberalism, it seems to me, is that the university in its structure of professional schools has brought onto campus, in most universities, a school that is the very bastion of neoliberalism. These are management schools. These are people whose careers, whose academic enterprise are to sing the praises of a unified ideology, and whose academic work, often through rubrics such as appreciative inquiry and the like, seek to pathologize and, as mental illness, critique and resistance to the ideology of neoliberalism. You've thought about this a lot. How do activists on campuses react in a collegial basis of shared governance in which the management school is equally represented in the Senate with all the other schools, or proportionally, with this reality that there is a bastion that's paid to believe that?
Yeah. Extra academic market. Paid twice or 3 times as much as the rest of us are.
Yeah, as are doctors and people in law schools. And this has been a problem from the start, you know, that there are engineers often tend to be because many of them work very closely with the corporate sector, also some tend to be more, what should we say, corporate friendly.
That's an elective affinity rather than a calling.
I see what you mean, yeah. To be quite frank, I haven't thought about that, and it is clearly, I've been active in the AAUP for a while, and we do have people who are teaching business, but not necessarily from business schools, you know. In other words, these are people who are teaching accounting rather than management, which I think is somewhat different. And I don't know how one could possibly appeal to these people. It's a political question, really, more than an intellectual one, I guess.
We have two aspects that, one you might be interested in, the other is that's consistent with what you said. In 2011, 50% of our the course hours were taught by non-tenured track people. So, I mean, there's at this institution here. The other thing that we have is a cadre of silverbacks that we've created here. And this group of people are recognized by their colleagues as people who are not really teaching a lot and not necessarily our best teachers. But the most concerning thing to me is that the younger assistant and associate professors look at these silverbacks and say, you know, I want that too. And if that's what I have to do to get it, I really don't have to do a lot of teaching. So that to me is one of the most concerning things that goes on at this institution.
And this has been a problem actually for my work because of my activism in the AAUP, which is the only organization that represents faculty as faculty, not as within a specific discipline. And so I think over the years, I have been looking at faculty and sort of trying to advocate for faculty and shoving under the rug some of the problems that the faculty itself has caused. And I think we have to begin to sort of call out those in our own profession who are not really concerned with their students, with the fate of higher education. We have to do a little bit of consciousness raising among ourselves. You know, I think we all have colleagues who we know are not carrying their load. And this, of course, feeds into all the attacks on tenure, right? Because this notion that, you know, I have a colleague who's not exactly all there, and you know, what do you do? What in the world do you do? I mean, the main thing we're doing is just plain, or I'm no longer there, thank God, and don't have to deal with it. But the main thing, you know, is sort of saying, look, you get your act together, we're not going to promote you to full professor. But the problem here is that out there in the world, that right-wing PR campaign against the university can take examples of genuine dead wood and say, see, tenure is, you know, extraneous. You don't need it. It is a scam on the American taxpayer, God forbid. And people who have no less and less job security are, of course, buying into this. So it is a problem. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ted Steinberg. I'm also in the history department and at the law school, what's left of law school. But my question is to pick up on what you were just saying. I guess there's dead wood everywhere. I mean, you talk to lawyers, doctors, there's lots of dead wood.
Yeah.
It's all over the place. I see it a little bit differently. I was the president for a year of the local AAUP chapter here. Average age of the membership, 115. I was,
Yeah.
And I think the problem with respect to consciousness is very important. My sense is, and my colleagues, the colleagues I know, work hard. I work hard, 60, 70-hour weeks, and they do too. The problem is, seems to me that they don't identify as workers and aren't interested in the conditions of their employment. I am. I see myself as a worker. I want to be paid like everybody else and fairly. And of course, in a private university, you can't find that information out because the salaries are secret. People run around with all sorts of wild ideas about what everybody else is making, that kind of business. But what I find mystifying is that I don't understand how this is. They identify as members of a profession and they're quite eager to join the AHA and OAH and whatever else their specialty is, but they don't, AAUP, I mean, it is expensive, I know, as you know, to join.
What is your question?
My question is how how we change
It's
this.
that culture,
I mean,
yeah.
how you change people, transform people in an environment who don't see themselves as workers, who see themselves as historians, psychologists, into people who see themselves as workers. Sorry to be so long-winded.
Well, if you're lucky, you get a real outrage from the administration. Our administration several years ago hired a new assistant provost, and he began to talk about reimagining the university. And boy, we had an AAUP meeting that was packed. But again, that's transitional. You're lucky you get 1 or 2 months of activism. People talk about, we're going to really do something. And this time, actually, they did. But it was mainly because there was pressure from the accrediting organization, which had talked about the fact there was no faculty governance at Yeshiva. And they were terrified of not getting accredited or getting delayed in their accreditation. So they all of a sudden, the administration said, oh, we're going to have a university senate. We have no university senate. Of course, the solution might have been unions, organizing. That's right. And Yeshiva did have a union. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which in one of its great 5-4 decisions decided that faculty members were management, right? And managers, I wasn't there at the time, but what happened was that after the decision came down, the manager's course load was increased. Okay, but faculty members, what's interesting is the AAUP now represents mainly faculty at unionized campuses. And in the late 60s and early 70s, it, as it went into the field of union organizing among faculties, it had about 90,000 members, I think. It now has 45,000. Many faculty members quit, and they quit because they assumed that unions meant that some kind of thugs from Detroit were going to come in and tell them what they were supposed to teach. And they didn't realize that, in fact, unionization usually, though not always, would give faculty members more control over their working conditions. You can write it into the contract, and it's not just based on some AAUP regulations or policy proposals that have no teeth. I don't know how you do it. You just have to keep talking to your colleagues and organizing and trying to get people more and more aware of the fact that they are no longer independent professionals in the way they think they are.
I'm Bob Strassfeld. I teach at what's been described as the remnant of the law school, because today wasn't grim enough and made grimmer by everything you have to tell us. So neoliberalism is global in its reach, and I'm wondering if when you look out at universities elsewhere, are there places that are either resisting or innovating in ways that we can learn from?
You mean other countries?
Yeah.
Why do you think universities are establishing these branch campuses all over? It's not just money, it's also the kind of freedom from traditional faculty pressures. I'm not so sure this is happening. I know that the academic system in Great Britain has been is privatizing very quickly, and that faculty members there have some kind of national system of being kind of getting so many points for their research. It's really been quantified in a very apparently stressful way. Yeah, whatever it is. And so I don't know of any place where you could talk about nirvana for faculties. I don't. You know, and many places do not have anywhere near like the American tradition of academic freedom. It's happening everywhere.
Let's have one last question. Over here. Yeah.
Are you suggesting then that unless faculty rise up and, come together to make a change, that this business model is going to continue to influence and significantly change higher education as we know it?
Yes. But also what I think is going to happen, and we talked about this a little at lunch, is that what we're seeing is a very serious stratification of American higher education, with schools that are well endowed, Ivy League, Research One schools, still able most of the time to offer the kind of traditional education, with teachers in classrooms and libraries and reading books and things like that people used to do. But that at the lower tiers, it's going to be this cheap, canned, over the internet with adjuncts or facilitators, they may be called, doing whatever has to be done to keep this system in motion, but not really getting students engaged in, dare I say it, thinking. So I'm not optimistic. Well, unless let me pull back a bit. There is some hope, perhaps, if we can reach students, and their parents, and because the connection between the loan and the student debt, which is really so oppressive for so many people. If we can make that connection, make them understand where it's coming from and what the problem really is, and that it's a political problem and not the fault of us tenured radicals, there may be a way to get at this, but it's going to require a lot of education. I mean, one thing we might think about doing is just talking a little bit to our students. I know that you're not supposed to bring in unrelated material into your classes, but perhaps just a little bit, at one point where it might fit. Kind of showing them what it is and why they are in the situation they are, facing so much debt. So maybe that'll help.